They told you Canada was built on politeness and maple syrup. They showed you the Mounties in their red uniforms and the peaceful expansion westward. They taught you about Confederation and the railway that connected the nation from coast to coast. But what they didn't teach you? The residential schools that operated until 1996. The forced sterilization programs that ran into the 1970s. The Chinese head tax that destroyed families for profit. The internment camps on Canadian soil. The medical experiments on Indigenous children without consent. Canada's real history isn't the friendly neighbor story you learned in school. It's darker, stranger, and more brutal than most people realize. These are 101 facts about Canadian history that were conveniently left out of your textbooks. Let's start where it really began. Number 1. In 1847, during the height of the Irish famine migration, the quarantine station on Grosse Île in the St. Lawrence River became a mass graveyard. Over 5,000 Irish immigrants died on that island, most of them in fever sheds that were little more than wooden barns. The ships that brought them were called coffin ships because so many passengers died during the voyage across the Atlantic. When these vessels arrived at Grosse Île, the healthy were separated from the sick, but the quarantine facilities were so overwhelmed that families were torn apart on the docks. Children watched their parents carried away to die alone. The bodies were buried in mass graves, trenches dug into the island soil where hundreds were laid without markers or ceremony. Today, if you visit Grosse Île, you can still see the Irish Memorial Cross standing over those burial grounds. But what most visitors don't know is that the actual number of dead may have been far higher than official records show, because many deaths on the ships were never documented before the bodies were thrown overboard into the cold Atlantic waters. Number 2. The Halifax explosion of 1917 remains the largest man-made explosion before the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. On December 6th, a French cargo ship called the Mont Blanc, loaded with wartime explosives, collided with a Norwegian vessel in Halifax Harbor. The Mont Blanc was carrying 2.9 kilotons of explosives, including TNT, picric acid, and benzol. After the collision, a fire broke out on the Mont Blanc's deck. For 20 minutes, the ship drifted toward the Halifax shoreline while curious crowds gathered along the waterfront to watch the burning vessel. No one knew what was about to happen. At 9:04 in the morning, the Mont Blanc exploded with a force so powerful it created a tsunami in the harbor, flattened entire neighborhoods, and shattered windows 50 miles away in Truro. Nearly 2,000 people were killed instantly. Another 9,000 were injured. The explosion generated a mushroom cloud that rose over 2 miles into the winter sky above Halifax. The blast was so powerful that a half-ton section of the Mont Blanc's anchor was found 2 miles away from the harbor. In the immediate aftermath, a blizzard hit the city, burying the injured and the dead under snow, while rescuers desperately searched through the rubble of collapsed buildings. Many survivors were left permanently blind because they had been watching the burning ship through their windows when the explosion turned the glass into thousands of flying shards that shredded their eyes. Number 3. Between 1869 and 1939, over 100,000 British children were sent to Canada as part of the Home Children Immigration Scheme. These were orphans, street children, and kids from poorhouse families in Britain who were shipped across the ocean with promises of a better life on Canadian farms. But the reality was far different from the promise. Most of these children, some as young as 4 years old, were used as indentured laborers on farms across Ontario, Quebec, and the Prairie provinces. They worked from dawn until dark, received little to no education, and were often beaten, starved, or sexually abused by the families who took them in. The Canadian government actively encouraged this program because it provided cheap labor for farmers and was seen as a way to build up the white population in rural areas. Many of these home children were told they were orphans even when their parents were still alive in Britain. Families were deliberately separated, and records were destroyed to prevent reunification. The children were marked with a stigma that followed them throughout their lives. Even into adulthood, former home children faced discrimination and were often denied jobs or housing because of their backgrounds. The last of these child migrants arrived in Canada in 1939, but the trauma of the program echoed through generations. Many descendants of home children only discovered their family history decades later when immigration records were finally open to the public. Number 4. In 1885, after the completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway, the federal government imposed a head tax on Chinese immigrants. The tax started at $50 per person, which was equivalent to 2 years' wages for a Chinese laborer. The purpose was clear: to discourage Chinese immigration after Chinese workers had already done the dangerous, back-breaking work of blasting tunnels through the Rocky Mountains and laying tracks across the Canadian wilderness. Thousands of Chinese laborers died building that railway, buried in avalanches, killed in explosions, or crushed by falling rock. Their bodies were never recovered, their names never recorded. Once the railway was complete, they were no longer needed. So the government made it financially impossible for Chinese workers to bring their families to Canada. In 1900, the head tax was raised to $100. In 1903, it was raised again to $500, the cost of 2 houses at the time. Between 1885 and 1923, the Canadian government collected $23 million from Chinese immigrants through this racist tax. Then, in 1923, the government went even further and passed the Chinese Immigration Act, which completely banned Chinese immigration to Canada. For the next 24 years, virtually no Chinese immigrants were allowed into the country. Families were separated for decades. Men who had come to Canada to work sent money back to wives and children in China, but they could never see them again. The act wasn't repealed until 1947, and the Canadian government didn't formally apologize for the head tax until 2006. Number 5. The numbered treaties signed between the Canadian government and First Nations peoples across the prairies and the North between 1871 and 1921 were based on deliberate mistranslations and broken promises. Indigenous leaders were told they were signing agreements to share the land, not to surrender it. The Cree phrase used in negotiations, "as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow," was meant to convey a relationship of mutual respect and shared stewardship. But the English text of the treaties spoke of land surrender and government ownership. Medicine chests were promised under Treaty 6 to provide health care for First Nations communities, but these promises were ignored for over a century. Hunting and fishing rights were supposed to be protected, but Indigenous people were later prosecuted for exercising those very rights on their own traditional territories. Farming equipment and livestock promised under the treaties were often never delivered, or arrived broken and unusable. When First Nations communities tried to protest the violations of treaty terms, they were met with laws designed to suppress their political organization. The Indian Act made it illegal for Indigenous peoples to hire lawyers to pursue land claims. It became a criminal offense for more than 3 Indigenous people to gather for political purposes without government permission. The treaties were never meant to be honored. They were tools of dispossession, legal documents that allowed the government to claim legitimacy while systematically stripping Indigenous peoples of their lands, resources, and autonomy. Number 6. Between 1907 and 1948, the Sexual Sterilization Act in Alberta and British Columbia authorized the forced sterilization of thousands of people deemed mentally defective or morally degenerate. The majority of victims were women, many of them teenagers or young adults who had been institutionalized. Indigenous women were sterilized at disproportionately high rates. Women who had given birth outside of marriage were labeled as mentally unfit and sterilized without their knowledge or consent. The operations were performed in provincial institutions, often under the guise of other medical procedures like appendectomies. Patients were told they were having routine surgeries and only discovered years later, when they tried to have children, that they had been permanently sterilized. In Alberta alone, nearly 3,000 people were sterilized under this program. The eugenic ideology behind the law was rooted in the belief that certain populations, including Indigenous peoples, immigrants from Eastern Europe, and people with disabilities, were inferior and needed to be prevented from reproducing. The goal was to create a pure, healthy population by eliminating those considered undesirable. These sterilization programs continued well into the 1970s in some provinces, long after the horrors of Nazi eugenics had been exposed to the world. Canada never held anyone accountable for these crimes. Victims who came forward decades later to sue the government received minimal compensation, if any. The last forced sterilization under provincial law occurred in 1972, but the trauma inflicted on survivors and their families continues to this day. Number 7. The potlatch ban, implemented in 1885 as part of the Indian Act, made it illegal for Indigenous peoples on the West Coast to hold potlatch ceremonies. The potlatch was a central cultural practice among nations like the Kwakwaka, Waku, Haida, and Tlingit, a ceremony where families would gather to witness marriages, name children, mourn the dead, and redistribute wealth within the community. The Canadian government saw the potlatch as a barrier to assimilation because it reinforced Indigenous identity and collective values rather than private property and individual accumulation. So they banned it. Indigenous people caught holding potlatches could be imprisoned for up to 6 months. In 1921, at a potlatch in Alert Bay, British Columbia, Royal Canadian Mounted Police raided the ceremony and arrested 45 people. The government confiscated sacred regalia, masks, coppers, and ceremonial objects that had been passed down through generations. These items were sold to museums and private collectors across North America and Europe. Families lost their most precious cultural treasures, objects that held spiritual power and historical memory. The potlatch ban remained in effect until 1951, 66 years of cultural suppression enforced by law. Even after the ban was lifted, many of the stolen artifacts were never returned. Communities had to buy back their own cultural property from museums, or watch as their sacred objects remained locked away in glass cases thousands of miles from home. Number 8. In 1942, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Canadian government ordered the forced removal and internment of over 22,000 Japanese Canadians from the West Coast. Families were given less than 48 hours to pack what they could carry. Their homes, businesses, fishing boats, and personal property were confiscated and sold at auction, often for a fraction of their value. Japanese Canadian fishermen who had built thriving businesses on the Pacific coast watched as their boats were seized and sold to white fishermen who had long resented their competition. Entire communities were uprooted and sent to internment camps in the interior of British Columbia, or forced to work on sugar beet farms in Alberta and Manitoba. The camps were hastily constructed shacks with no insulation, no running water, and no privacy. Families lived in overcrowded conditions, separated by thin walls, struggling to survive harsh winters in the mountains. Children attended schools behind barbed wire fences. Men were sent to work camps building roads in northern Ontario, separated from their families for years. The Canadian government justified the internment as a national security measure, but there was never any evidence that Japanese Canadians posed a threat. Not a single Japanese Canadian was ever charged with espionage or sabotage during the war. This was racism, pure and simple, wrapped in the language of security. After the war ended, Japanese Canadians were told they could either move east of the Rockies or be deported to Japan, a country many of them had never seen. Thousands were forced to leave British Columbia permanently. The government didn't apologize for the internment until 1988, 46 years after the forced removal began. Number 9. The pass system, implemented unofficially in the 1880s and enforced until the 1930s, required Indigenous people living on reserves to obtain written permission from an Indian agent before they could leave reserve land. The pass had to state where the person was going, why they were traveling, and how long they would be away. Without a pass, Indigenous people could be arrested and forcibly returned to the reserve. The system was never officially part of the Indian Act, but it was enforced by police and Indian agents across the prairies as if it were law. The purpose was to control Indigenous movement and prevent them from organizing politically, trading freely, or visiting relatives on other reserves. Families were separated, unable to attend funerals or visit sick relatives without government permission. Indigenous farmers who wanted to sell their crops in town needed a pass. Children who wanted to visit their parents needed a pass. The pass system turned reserves into open-air prisons where Indigenous people had fewer rights than Canadian citizens, even though they were on their own land. Indian agents had absolute power over who could leave and who couldn't, and they used that power to punish those who resisted government policies or spoke out against injustice. The pass system was a form of apartheid, a regime of racial control that restricted freedom of movement based solely on Indigenous identity. It operated in direct violation of treaty rights and basic human freedoms, yet it persisted for over 50 years with the full knowledge and support of the Canadian government. Number 10. The residential school system, which operated from the 1870s until the last school closed in 1996, was designed with one explicit goal: cultural genocide. The government's official policy was to kill the Indian in the child. Over 150,000 Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to these institutions, many of them run by Catholic, Anglican, United, and Presbyterian churches. The schools were deliberately located far from reserves to make it difficult for parents to visit. Children as young as 4 years old were taken from their homes, often without their parents' consent. If families refused to send their children, Indian agents and police would come to the reserve and take them by force. At the schools, children were forbidden to speak their languages, practice their cultures, or even use their own names. They were given English or French names and punished severely for any display of Indigenous identity. Punishment included beatings with straps, sticks, and fists, confinement in closets or basements, public humiliation, and starvation. Children were fed rotten food, denied medical care, and forced to work long hours doing manual labor to keep the schools running. Thousands died from tuberculosis, malnutrition, and neglect. The death rate at some schools was over 50%. When children died, their bodies were often buried in unmarked graves on school grounds, and their parents were never notified. Some families only learned decades later that their child had died at residential school. Survivors of the schools have testified about physical abuse, sexual abuse, and psychological torture that continued for years. The trauma of residential schools didn't end when the schools closed. It echoed through generations, contributing to the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, substance abuse, suicide, and the destruction of Indigenous languages and cultural knowledge. Number 11. In 1914, the Komagata Maru, a ship carrying 376 passengers from India, arrived in Vancouver Harbor. Most of the passengers were Sikhs, along with some Muslims and Hindus, who were British subjects seeking to immigrate to Canada. Under British law, they had the right to move freely within the British Empire, but the Canadian government didn't want them. So immigration officials refused to let the passengers disembark, claiming they hadn't come directly from India and therefore didn't meet the continuous journey requirement, a racist regulation specifically designed to keep South Asians out of Canada. For 2 months, the ship sat in Vancouver Harbor, while the passengers, running out of food and water, pleaded to be allowed ashore. Local South Asian communities tried to bring supplies to the ship, but they were blocked by police boats. Immigration officials boarded the vessel and told the passengers they would never be allowed to land. After weeks of legal challenges and international pressure, the Canadian government ordered the ship to leave. On July 23rd, a naval vessel escorted the Komagata Maru out of Canadian waters. When the ship finally returned to India, British colonial authorities, suspicious of the passengers' political loyalties, ordered them to board a train to Punjab. The passengers refused, and British troops opened fire on the crowd. 20 people were killed. Many others were arrested and imprisoned. The Komagata Maru incident was a direct result of Canada's racist immigration policies, which used bureaucratic tricks to exclude non-white immigrants while maintaining the appearance of equality under British law. Number 12. The destruction of Africville, a black community in Halifax, Nova Scotia, is one of the most egregious examples of environmental racism in Canadian history. Africville was founded in the 1800s by black refugees and freedmen who settled on the shores of Bedford Basin. For over a century, the community thrived despite being systematically denied basic services by the city of Halifax. The city refused to provide running water, sewage systems, paved roads, garbage collection, or streetlights to Africville, even as these services were extended to neighboring white communities. Instead, the city decided to place its most undesirable facilities right next to Africville. A slaughterhouse, an infectious disease hospital, a prison, and eventually a massive garbage dump were all located on the edge of the community. The dump attracted rats, created foul smells, and contaminated the soil and water. Then, in the 1960s, the city decided that Africville was a slum and needed to be cleared. Residents were told they would be relocated to better housing and compensated fairly. But the promises were lies. Families were forced out of their homes, which were demolished by city crews. Some residents watched as their houses were torn down and loaded onto garbage trucks, a deliberate humiliation. The compensation offered was far below the market value of the properties, and many families ended up in worse conditions in public housing projects far from their community and their church. The land where Africville once stood was turned into an industrial park, and later a park named after the very community that had been destroyed. In 2010, the city of Halifax finally apologized, but the damage was done. An entire community with its own culture, history, and sense of place had been erased. Number 13. The Manitoba Schools. Question of the 1890s stripped French-speaking Catholics of their educational rights and set the stage for decades of linguistic discrimination. When Manitoba joined Confederation in 1870, the Manitoba Act guaranteed rights to both English and French languages and protected separate Catholic and Protestant school systems. But by 1890, the English-speaking Protestant majority in Manitoba passed legislation that eliminated public funding for Catholic schools and made English the only language of instruction. French-speaking Métis and Catholic communities suddenly found themselves forced to pay taxes for public schools they couldn't use while also funding their own Catholic schools out of pocket. Children were forbidden from receiving education in French, the language of their homes and their culture. The federal government had the power to intervene and protect minority rights, but Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier chose political compromise over constitutional principle. The result was a patchwork solution that left French language rights in Manitoba severely weakened for over 70 years. It wasn't until 1970 that French was restored as an official language of instruction in Manitoba schools, 80 years after it had been stripped away. Number 14. In 1919, the Winnipeg General Strike brought the city to a standstill for 6 weeks as 30,000 workers walked off their jobs demanding better wages, collective bargaining rights, and improved working conditions. The strike was organized by a broad coalition of workers, from metal workers to telephone operators, from bakers to postal workers. On June 21st, a day that became known as Bloody Saturday, the Royal Northwest Mounted Police charged into a crowd of striking workers on Main Street. The Mounties rode their horses directly into the peaceful demonstration, swinging clubs and firing guns into the crowd. 2 men were killed. Mike Sokolowski, a Ukrainian immigrant, was shot in the heart. Steve Szczerbanovich, another immigrant worker, was shot and later died from his wounds. Dozens more were injured, trampled by horses, or beaten with batons. The federal government blamed the violence on foreign agitators and Bolshevik influence, using the strike as an excuse to crack down on labor, organizing, and radical politics. Strike leaders were arrested and charged with seditious conspiracy. Several were convicted and sentenced to prison. The Immigration Act was amended to allow the government to deport British-born subjects who were deemed undesirable, a direct response to the fact that many strike leaders were recent immigrants from Britain. The Winnipeg General Strike was portrayed in the press and by the government as a revolution that had to be crushed. In reality, it was workers asking for fair treatment and being met with state violence. Number 15. The War Measures Act, first invoked during World War I, gave the Canadian government sweeping powers to suspend civil liberties, censor the press, and detain people without trial. During World War I, the act was used to ban political organizations, seize property from enemy aliens, and imprison thousands of Ukrainian, German, and Austro-Hungarian immigrants in internment camps across Canada. These camps were labor camps, where internees were forced to clear land, build roads, and work in mines under armed guard. Over 8,000 people, most of them innocent civilians, whose only crime was their ethnicity, were imprisoned in these camps between 1914 and 1920. Internees were paid 25 cents a day for back-breaking labor in freezing conditions. Many died from accidents, disease, or exposure. The camps were located in remote areas like Banff, Jasper, and Kapuskasing, places where the internees' labor could be exploited to develop national parks and infrastructure. Families were separated. Men were taken from their homes and sent to camps hundreds of miles away, while their wives and children were left destitute. The businesses and properties of internees were seized and sold, often to their competitors. After the war ended, there was no compensation, no apology, no acknowledgement of what had been done. The internment of Ukrainian Canadians during World War I was conveniently forgotten, buried in the archives while the country celebrated its victory in Europe. Number 16. The On to Ottawa Trek of 1935 was a mass protest by unemployed men from relief camps across British Columbia who decided to ride the railways to Ottawa to demand work, wages, and better treatment from the federal government. During the Great Depression, thousands of single unemployed men were sent to remote relief camps. Run by the Department of National Defense, these camps were essentially labor camps where men worked for 20 cents a day, doing hard manual labor building roads and clearing land in isolated locations far from towns and cities. The conditions were brutal. The food was inadequate. The men were treated like prisoners, living in bunkhouses with no privacy, no access to newspapers or radios, and no freedom to leave. In April 1935, over 1,000 men walked out of the camps and began riding freight trains eastward toward Ottawa, picking up more unemployed workers in every town they passed through. By the time the trek reached Regina, Saskatchewan, there were nearly 2,000 men camped in the exhibition grounds. The federal government, led by Prime Minister R.B. Bennett, ordered the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to stop the trek. On Dominion Day, July 1st, police moved in to arrest the trek leaders during a public meeting at Market Square in Regina. What followed was a riot. Police charged the crowd, swinging batons and firing tear gas. Protesters fought back with rocks and sticks. One Regina police detective, Charles Miller, was killed in the chaos. Dozens of protesters were injured. Over 100 men were arrested. The On to Ottawa trek was over. The men were sent back to the camps or left to fend for themselves on the streets. The government portrayed the trekkers as dangerous radicals, but they were simply desperate men asking for the dignity of work and fair wages during an economic crisis that had left them with nothing. Number 17. The St. Louis, a ship carrying 907 Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany, was turned away from Canada in 1939. The passengers had already been denied entry to Cuba and the United States. Their last hope was Canada. Jewish organizations in Canada pleaded with the government to allow the refugees to land, but the Director of Immigration, Frederick Blair, was an open anti-Semite who believed that Jews were undesirable immigrants. He personally lobbied against accepting the refugees, writing in government memos that none is too many when it came to Jewish immigration. Prime Minister Mackenzie King's government refused to intervene. The Saint Louis was forced to return to Europe. Of the 907 passengers on board, 254 died in the Holocaust. They died in concentration camps, in gas chambers, in ghettos, deaths that could have been prevented if Canada had simply opened its doors. The none is too many policy wasn't just about the St. Louis. Between 1933 and 1945, while the Holocaust was happening, Canada accepted fewer than 5,000 Jewish refugees, one of the worst records of any Western country. After the war, when the full horror of the Holocaust became known, Canada still dragged its feet on admitting Jewish survivors. The immigration system prioritized white Europeans, farmers, and domestic workers, categories that deliberately excluded most Jewish refugees who were urban, educated, and had lost everything in the war. Number 18. In 1942, the federal government passed an order in council that allowed the confiscation and sale of property belonging to Japanese Canadians who had been forcibly removed from the West Coast. The government appointed a custodian of enemy property who was given the authority to liquidate Japanese Canadian assets without the owner's consent. Homes, farms, fishing boats, businesses, and personal belongings were sold at auction, often for pennies on the dollar. Japanese Canadians protested, but they had no legal recourse. They were in internment camps, far from their property, with no way to protect their assets. White Canadians who had coveted Japanese-owned farmland and fishing boats for years saw an opportunity and bought up the property at bargain prices. The money from these sales was supposed to be held in trust for the Japanese Canadian owners, but the government used it to pay for the internment camps, charging Japanese Canadians for the cost of their own imprisonment. By the time the war ended and Japanese Canadians were released from the camps, most had lost everything. They returned to find their homes occupied by strangers, their businesses sold, their savings depleted. The government told them it was their patriotic duty to accept the loss and move on. It wasn't until 1988 that the Canadian government formally apologized and provided symbolic compensation of $21,000 to each surviving Japanese Canadian who had been interned. Number 19, the Pier, 21 immigration station in Halifax, processed over 1 million immigrants between 1928 and 1971, but not all of those who arrived were welcomed. Medical inspections at Pier. 21 were used to exclude people with disabilities, chronic illnesses, or mental health conditions. Immigrants who failed the medical exam were marked with chalk on their clothing and detained. Families were separated when one member was deemed medically unfit. Children were sent back to Europe alone because they had a heart murmur or showed signs of developmental delay. The doctors at Pier 21 had the power to destroy lives with a single diagnosis. The medical inspection wasn't just about public health. It was about eugenics, about keeping out people who were considered undesirable or unfit. Immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe were subjected to more rigorous inspections than those from Britain or Northern Europe. Jewish refugees were scrutinized more harshly than Christian refugees. The immigration system at Pier 21 was designed to filter people based on race, nationality, and perceived genetic quality, ensuring that only the right kind of immigrants made it into Canada. Number 20, the Alberta Sexual Sterilization Act, passed in 1928, allowed the provincial government to sterilize individuals deemed mentally defective without their consent. A eugenics board was established to review cases and approve sterilizations. Between 1928 and 1972, nearly 3,000 people were sterilized under this act. Many of the victims were young women, some as young as 14 years old, who had been institutionalized for reasons that had nothing to do with mental capacity. A girl who became pregnant outside of marriage could be labeled as morally defective and sterilized. A woman who didn't conform to social expectations could be committed to an institution and sterilized without her knowledge. Indigenous women and girls were sterilized at rates far higher than the general population. The eugenics board didn't require informed consent. Patients were often told they were having routine medical procedures like appendectomies, and only discovered later that they had been permanently sterilized. One survivor, Leilani Muir, successfully sued the Alberta government in 1996 after discovering that she had been wrongfully institutionalized as a child and sterilized at age 14. The court found that Muir had been wrongly labeled as mentally defective when in fact she had a normal IQ, and that her sterilization was a violation of her fundamental human rights. Despite the ruling, the Alberta government never fully acknowledged the extent of the harm caused by the eugenics program or provided adequate compensation to all the survivors. Number 21. The forced relocation of Inuit communities in the high Arctic during the 1950s was carried out under the guise of sovereignty and humanitarian assistance, but the real purpose was to establish Canadian presence in the far north during the Cold War. The government wanted living proof of Canadian occupation in the Arctic islands to counter potential Soviet claims, so they convinced Inuit families from northern Quebec to relocate to Resolute Bay and Grise Fjord, two of the most remote and inhospitable locations in the Canadian Arctic. The families were told they would find better hunting and living conditions in the high Arctic. They were promised they could return home if things didn't work out. Both promises were lies. When the families arrived in Resolute and Grise Fjord, they found themselves in a barren frozen landscape with almost no wildlife, and temperatures that dropped to minus 50 degrees Celsius in winter. They lived in tents and makeshift shelters during the brutal Arctic winter. There were no supplies, no infrastructure, no support. The RCMP, who had been stationed in the area to assert Canadian sovereignty, had better housing and more resources than the Inuit families who were supposed to be settlers. The relocated families suffered from starvation, frostbite, and isolation. When they asked to be returned to their home communities, the government refused. They were trapped in the high Arctic. Human flags planted by the Canadian government to prove sovereignty over land that had always been Inuit territory anyway. It took decades of advocacy before the government finally acknowledged in 2010 that the relocations had caused profound hardship and suffering. But no amount of apologies could undo the trauma and loss experienced by those families. Number 22, the Indian hospitals that operated across Canada from the 1930s to the 1980s were segregated medical facilities where Indigenous patients were subjected to experimental treatments, inadequate care, and systemic neglect. These hospitals were created ostensibly to treat tuberculosis, which was rampant in Indigenous communities due to overcrowding, poor housing, and malnutrition on reserves. But the real purpose of the Indian hospitals was to isolate Indigenous patients from the general population and use them as research subjects. Indigenous children were taken from their families and sent to these hospitals, sometimes for years. Parents were not told where their children were or how they were being treated. Children underwent experimental drug trials without informed consent. They were subjected to nutritional experiments designed to test the effects of vitamin deficiencies. In one study at an Indian hospital in Manitoba, malnourished Indigenous children were deliberately kept on inadequate diets so researchers could study the progression of malnutrition. At the Nanaimo Indian Hospital on Vancouver Island, Indigenous patients were used to test new tuberculosis drugs that had severe side effects. Many patients developed hearing loss, kidney damage, or liver failure from the experimental medications. The mortality rate at Indian hospitals was significantly higher than at regular hospitals. Patients who died were often buried in unmarked graves on hospital grounds, and their families were never notified. The Indian hospital system was finally phased out in the 1980s, but the legacy of medical experimentation and abuse continues to fuel deep mistrust of the healthcare system among Indigenous communities today. Number 23. The 60s scoop refers to a period from the 1960s to the 1980s when thousands of Indigenous children were taken from their families by child welfare authorities and placed in foster care or adopted out to non-Indigenous families. The term was coined by Patrick Johnston in his 1983 report on Indigenous child welfare, but the practice itself was a direct continuation of the residential school system's goal of assimilating Indigenous children into white Canadian society. Social workers would arrive on reserves with little warning and apprehend children based on vague allegations of neglect or inadequate living conditions. The real issue wasn't abuse or neglect in most cases. It was poverty, a direct result of decades of government policies that had stripped Indigenous communities of their land, resources, and economic opportunities. But instead of addressing the systemic causes of poverty, the government chose to remove the children. During the height of the 60s scoop, Indigenous children made up 30 to 40% of all children in foster care in some provinces, despite Indigenous people representing less than 4% of the population. These children were placed with white, middle-class families, often hundreds or thousands of miles from their home communities. They were given new names, forbidden from speaking their languages, and raised with no knowledge of their culture or identity. Many were told their parents had abandoned them or were dead, lies designed to sever all connection to their families and communities. When these children grew up, they often struggled with identity, belonging, and mental health. They didn't fit in white society, but they had been cut off from their Indigenous communities for so long that they didn't know how to reconnect. Suicide rates among 60s scoop survivors are tragically high. In 2017, the Canadian government reached a settlement agreement with 60 scoop survivors, acknowledging the harm caused by these apprehensions, but no amount of money can undo the cultural genocide inflicted on an entire generation of Indigenous children. Number 24. The 1885 execution of Louis Riel, the Métis leader who had fought for the rights of his people during the Red River and Northwest rebellions, was a politically motivated killing that turned Riel into a martyr and deepened the divide between English and French Canada. Riel had established a provisional government in Manitoba in 1869 to negotiate terms for the province's entry into Confederation, ensuring that Métis land rights and French language rights would be protected. He was largely successful, and the Manitoba Act of 1870 seemed to promise a future for the Métis in the new province. But the federal government never honored those promises. Métis lands were taken by settlers, and Métis people were pushed further west onto the prairies. In 1885, facing similar pressures in Saskatchewan, the Métis again turned to Riel for leadership. The Northwest Rebellion was a desperate attempt to force the government to recognize Métis' rights and address their grievances. The rebellion was quickly crushed by Canadian military forces, and Riel was arrested and charged with high treason. His trial was a sham. The jury was composed entirely of English-speaking Protestants. Riel was not allowed to testify in French. His defense argued that he was insane and therefore not responsible for his actions, but Riel himself rejected this defense, insisting that he had acted rationally in defense of his people's rights. The jury found him guilty, but recommended mercy. The judge ignored the recommendation and sentenced Riel to death by hanging. Despite widespread protests, especially in Quebec, where Riel was seen as a defender of French and Catholic rights, Prime Minister John A. Macdonald refused to commute the sentence. On November 16, 1885, Louis Riel was hanged in Regina. His execution was a message to all who would resist the expansion of Canadian authority, and it fueled decades of resentment between French and English Canadians. Number 25. The Komagata-Maru passengers who were forced to return to India in 1914 faced violence and imprisonment upon their arrival. When the ship docked in Calcutta, British colonial authorities suspected the passengers of sedition and ordered them to board a train that would take them inland to Punjab. The passengers, angry and humiliated after their treatment in Canada, refused. They demanded to be allowed to go home on their own terms. British troops opened fire on the crowd. 19 people were killed on the spot. Many others were arrested and sent to prison, where they were held for months or years without trial. Some of the passengers who survived became involved in the Indian independence movement, radicalized by their experience of racism in Canada and colonial violence in India. The Komagata-Maru incident became a symbol of resistance against both Canadian immigration, racism, and British imperialism. But in Canada, the story was buried for decades. It was only in 2008 that the Canadian government issued a formal apology for turning away the ship. And even then, the apology was criticized as incomplete because it didn't acknowledge the full extent of the violence and injustice that followed the passengers back to India. Number 26. The forced assimilation of Doukhobor children in British Columbia during the 1950s involved the mass apprehension of children from a radical sect known as the Sons of Freedom. The Doukhobors were a pacifist religious group who had immigrated to Canada from Russia in the late 1800s. Most Doukhobors lived peacefully, but a radical faction known as the Sons of Freedom engaged in acts of protest, including arson and public nudity, to resist government policies they saw as oppressive. In 1953, the BC government passed legislation that allowed authorities to seize the children of Sons of Freedom families and place them in a residential school in New Denver. Over 150 children were taken from their parents and held at the New Denver School for up to 3 years. They were not allowed contact with their families. They were punished for speaking Russian, their native language. The trauma of separation and institutionalization caused lasting psychological harm to these children. Parents who protested the seizure of their children were arrested and imprisoned. The government justified the apprehensions by claiming it was necessary to provide the children with proper education and protect them from their parents' radical beliefs. But the real goal was to break the resistance of the Sons of Freedom by targeting their children, using the same assimilationist tactics that had been deployed against Indigenous children in residential schools. Number 27. The deliberate destruction of the buffalo herds on the Canadian prairies in the late 1800s was a strategy to force Indigenous peoples onto reserves by eliminating their primary food source. Before European contact, an estimated 30 to 60 million buffalo roamed the Great Plains. By 1890, fewer than 1,000 remained. The mass slaughter was encouraged by both Canadian and American governments as a way to clear the land for settlers and railways, and to starve Indigenous nations into submission. Plains peoples like the Cree, Blackfoot, and Assiniboine depended on the buffalo for food, clothing, shelter, and tools. The buffalo was the foundation of their economy and culture. When the herds disappeared, entire communities faced starvation. The Canadian government knew this would happen. In fact, they counted on it. Starving people would have no choice but to sign treaties and move on to reserves where they would be dependent on government rations. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald openly acknowledged this strategy, stating in Parliament that Indigenous peoples needed to be kept on the verge of starvation to ensure they remained on reserves and didn't resist the expansion of white settlement. The buffalo didn't just disappear due to overhunting by settlers and hide traders. The Canadian government actively prevented Indigenous hunters from accessing the remaining herds, enforced game laws that criminalized traditional hunting, and did nothing to stop American hunters from crossing the border to kill buffalo on Canadian territory. By the time the buffalo were nearly extinct, Plains nations had lost their independence and were confined to reserves where they faced chronic hunger, disease, and poverty. Number 28. In 1914, the Canadian government interned over 8,000 Ukrainian, German, and Austro-Hungarian immigrants in labor camps, not because they posed any security threat, but because their labor could be exploited and their presence was politically convenient to justify wartime security measures. Most of the internees were working-class men, many of them unemployed due to the economic recession that preceded World War I. They were labeled as enemy aliens simply because they had been born in countries that were now at war with Britain. Internment camps were set up in remote areas like Banff, Jasper, and Spirit Lake, where internees were forced to work on infrastructure projects that benefited the war effort and the post-war economy. They built roads, cleared land, and worked in mines and national parks under armed guard. The camps were cold, overcrowded, and unsanitary. Internees were paid a pittance, 25 cents a day, far below the wages paid to free laborers doing the same work. Many internees were never charged with any crime. They were held indefinitely based on suspicion and ethnicity alone. Families of internees were left destitute when the breadwinner was taken away. Businesses owned by enemy aliens were seized or vandalized. Churches were vandalized and Ukrainian-language newspapers were shut down. The internment operations continued even after the war ended in 1918. The last camp didn't close until 1920, 2 years after the armistice. When internees were finally released, they received no compensation for the years of forced labor or the property and wages they had lost. The Canadian government didn't acknowledge the injustice of the Ukrainian internment until 2005, and even then, the compensation provided to the Ukrainian-Canadian community was symbolic rather than restitutive. Number 29. The Christie Pitts riot of 1933 was one of the worst race riots in Canadian history. A violent confrontation between Nazi sympathizers and Jewish youth in Toronto that exposed the deep currents of anti-Semitism in Canadian society. The riot took place at Christie Pitts Park during a baseball game between a predominantly Jewish team and a team from a mostly Anglo-Protestant neighborhood. Tensions had been building for weeks after members of a local swim club displayed a swastika, the Nazi symbol, at the beach and harassed Jewish swimmers. On the night of August 16th, a group of young men unfurled a large swastika banner at the baseball game, shouting anti-Semitic slurs at the Jewish players and spectators. A fight broke out. Within minutes, the fight escalated into a full-scale riot as hundreds of people joined in, some wielding clubs, iron bars, and knives. The violence lasted for hours, spilling out of the park and into the surrounding streets. Jewish youth and their allies fought back against the attackers, but they were outnumbered. The police response was slow and inadequate, and many witnesses later reported that some officers seemed sympathetic to the rioters waving swastika flags. The Christie Pitts riot was a stark reminder that fascism and anti-Semitism were not just European problems. They were present in Canada, thriving in the ethnic and religious tensions of a city that prided itself on being civilized and tolerant. In the aftermath of the riot, there was no serious effort by authorities to address the underlying anti-Semitism that had fueled the violence. The incident was downplayed in the press, and the rioters were never held accountable. Number 30. The 1960s forced relocation of the Saisi Dene from their traditional territory in northern Manitoba to the town of Churchill was a catastrophic policy that destroyed a community and led to decades of trauma, addiction, and deaths. The Saisi Dene were a caribou-hunting people who had lived on the land for thousands of years. In 1956, the federal government decided to relocate them to Churchill, ostensibly to provide them with access to modern services and education. But the real reason was to make way for a military base and to clear the land for resource extraction. The Dene were moved into a settlement on the outskirts of Churchill, a dump site near the town garbage heap. They had no housing, no jobs, and no means to continue their traditional way of life. The caribou herds they depended on did not migrate near Churchill. Hunting and trapping were impossible in their new location. The community was given welfare payments, but no support to rebuild their economy or adapt to the new environment. Within a few years, the community was devastated by poverty, alcoholism, and violence. Children stopped going to school. Suicide rates soared. Families disintegrated. Between 1956 and 1973, the Saisi Dene population dropped by more than half as people died from accidents, illness, suicide, and the effects of chronic malnutrition and substance abuse. It wasn't until the 1970s that survivors began to advocate for the right to return to their traditional territory. In 1973, some families were finally allowed to move back to the land, but the damage had been done. An entire generation had been lost, and the community's cultural knowledge and social structures had been shattered by 2 decades of forced displacement and neglect. Number 31. The Indian Act Amendments of 1927 made it illegal for Indigenous peoples to hire lawyers or raise funds to pursue land claims against the Canadian government. Section 141 of the Act stated that anyone who solicited funds for the purpose of pursuing an Indian claim without the consent of the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs could be prosecuted and punished. This law was specifically designed to silence Indigenous political organizing and prevent First Nations from using the courts to challenge the government's violations of treaty rights. It was in effect for 24 years, from 1927 to 1951, a period during which Indigenous peoples were effectively barred from seeking legal redress for the theft of their lands and resources. The law was passed at a time when Indigenous leaders were becoming increasingly vocal in demanding that the government honor treaty obligations. The allied tribes of British Columbia had been preparing a major land claim to present to the British Privy Council, the highest court of appeal in the British Empire. The federal government, fearing that such a claim might succeed and expose the illegality of much of British Columbia's land base, moved preemptively to shut down all legal challenges. The 1927 amendment didn't just ban lawyers and fundraising. It criminalized the very act of political advocacy on behalf of Indigenous land rights. Indigenous leaders who defied the ban risked arrest. Communities that tried to organize were harassed by Indian agents and police. The law was a gag order, a systematic suppression of Indigenous political and legal rights that lasted for nearly a quarter century. Number 32. The Maple Leaf Gardens sex abuse scandal revealed decades of institutional cover-up and complicity in the sexual exploitation of young boys by arena staff. Between 1969 and 1988, Gordon Stuckless, an equipment manager at Maple Leaf Gardens, sexually abused at least 18 boys, some as young as 8 years old. Stuckless used his position of authority and access to the arena to groom vulnerable children, offering them tickets to hockey games, access to players, and jobs as stick boys in exchange for their silence about the abuse. For nearly 2 decades, the abuse continued, and management at Maple Leaf Gardens did nothing to stop it, even though there were complaints and rumors. In the 1970s, a parent reported to Gardens management that their child had been abused by Stuckless, but no action was taken. Instead of reporting the abuse to police or firing Stuckless, the Gardens management chose to protect the institution's reputation and allowed the abuse to continue. Other staff members at the arena were also accused of sexual abuse, including John Paul Roby, an usher who assaulted dozens of boys over many years. When the scandal finally broke in 1997, after one of the victims came forward publicly, it emerged that Maple Leaf Gardens had been aware of the abuse for years and had actively covered it up. Stuckless was eventually convicted and sentenced to prison, but the sentence was widely criticized as too lenient for the scale and duration of his crimes. The victims, many of whom suffered lifelong trauma from the abuse, received financial settlements from Maple Leaf Gardens, but no amount of money could undo the damage or hold accountable all those who had turned a blind eye to the abuse for so many years. Number 33. The forced closure of Indigenous day schools in the 1950s and 1960s, and the subsequent busing of Indigenous children to distant provincial schools, was another form of cultural assimilation that disrupted communities and exposed children to racism and alienation. Unlike residential schools, day schools were located on or near reserves and allowed children to live at home with their families. While day schools were still part of the colonial education system and often provided inferior education, they at least allowed children to maintain daily contact with their families and communities. But in the name of integration, the federal government began closing these day schools and busing Indigenous children to provincial schools in nearby towns and cities. The policy was sold as progress, a way to give Indigenous children access to the same quality of education as non-Indigenous children, but in practice, it meant that Indigenous children were thrust into hostile environments where they faced racism, bullying, and cultural isolation. Teachers and students in provincial schools often had no understanding of or respect for Indigenous cultures. Indigenous children were mocked for their appearance, their accents, their clothing. They were told that their cultures were primitive and their languages were worthless. Many children internalized these messages and grew up ashamed of their identity. The long bus rides to and from school, sometimes over an hour, each way on rough roads, were exhausting and took time away from family, homework, and sleep. For children in remote communities, the closure of local day schools meant they had to leave home entirely and attend residential schools or live with foster families in town, recreating the same separation and trauma that residential schools had inflicted. Number 34. The Oka crisis of 1990 was a 78-day armed standoff between Mohawk protesters, Quebec police, and the Canadian Army over a land dispute in the town of Oka, Quebec. The conflict began when the town of Oka announced plans to expand a golf course onto land that included a Mohawk burial ground and a sacred pine grove. The Mohawks of Kanesatake had been fighting for recognition of their land rights for over 270 years, ever since French colonial authorities had granted the land to a Catholic seminary in the 1700s. Every legal avenue had been exhausted, every petition ignored. So when the town proceeded with the golf course expansion, Mohawk Ulo community members set up a blockade on a dirt road leading to the contested land. On July 11th, Quebec police launched a raid to dismantle the blockade. Shots were fired. A police officer, Corporal Marcel Lemay, was killed, though to this day it remains unclear who fired the fatal shot. The standoff escalated rapidly. Mohawks from Kanawake, a reserve south of Montreal, set up a solidarity blockade on the Mercier Bridge, one of the main routes into Montreal, causing massive traffic disruptions and inflaming tensions. The Quebec government called in the Canadian Army. Thousands of soldiers, armored personnel carriers, and helicopters descended on the small Mohawk community. For over 2 months, the world watched as armed Mohawk warriors faced off against one of the most powerful militaries in the world. The images were stark. Mohawk protesters in camouflage and masks standing behind barricades, soldiers with assault rifles patrolling the perimeter, razor wire surrounding the community. During the standoff, Mohawk families living in Kanawak and Kanesatake faced harassment and violence from angry mobs of white residents who threw rocks at cars, shouted racial slurs, and burned effigies. An elderly Mohawk man died of a heart attack when a mob attacked the convoy of vehicles trying to leave Kanawake. The crisis finally ended on September 26th, when the remaining protesters walked out of the treatment center where they had been barricaded, surrounded by soldiers. But the underlying land dispute was never resolved. The golf course expansion was canceled, but the Mohawks still don't have clear title to the land their ancestors are buried in. The Oka crisis became a symbol of Indigenous resistance and a wake-up call to Canadians about the unresolved land issues and systemic injustices facing First Nations. Number 35. The Highway of Tears is a section of Highway 16 in northern British Columbia where at least 40 Indigenous women and girls have disappeared or been murdered since the 1970s. The highway stretches over 700 kilometers from Prince George to Prince Rupert, passing through remote communities with limited public transportation. Many of the women who disappeared were last seen hitchhiking along the highway, often because they had no other way to travel between communities, for work, school, medical appointments, or to visit family. The victims were overwhelmingly Indigenous, young, and from poor communities. Their disappearances were often not taken seriously by police. Investigations were delayed or inadequate. Families of the missing women had to organize their own searches, put up their own posters, and pressure authorities to take action. For decades, the pattern of disappearances was ignored by the broader Canadian public. It wasn't until the early 2000s, after relentless advocacy by Indigenous women's groups and families of the victims, that the crisis began to receive national attention. In 2006, the RCMP finally acknowledged that there was a serious problem on Highway 16 and launched a project to review the cases. But even then, the response was insufficient. Promised improvements to public transportation along the highway were delayed or never materialized. Communities continued to lack basic services. Women continued to disappear. The highway of tears is not just about individual crimes. It's a manifestation of the systemic violence and neglect faced by Indigenous women across Canada, a crisis rooted in colonialism, racism, poverty, and the ongoing failure of Canadian institutions to protect Indigenous lives. Number 36. The Innu of Labrador were subjected to low-level military flights by NATO forces training out of CFB Goose Bay from the 1980s until the early 2000s, a form of environmental violence that devastated their hunting grounds and way of life. The military jets flew at extremely low altitudes, sometimes just 30 meters above the ground, creating deafening sonic booms that terrified wildlife and disrupted the Innu's traditional hunting and trapping. Caribou herds changed their migration patterns to avoid the noise. Fish populations declined in lakes and rivers near the flight paths. The Innu people, who depended on hunting and fishing for subsistence, saw their food sources disappear. The flights were constant, sometimes dozens per day, making it impossible for Innu families to live on the land as they had for thousands of years. Children growing up in Innu communities suffered from anxiety and sleep disorders caused by the relentless noise of military aircraft overhead. Elders mourned the loss of quiet, of the ability to hear the wind and the animals, the sounds that had guided their lives on the land. The Innu protested the military flights for years. They set up camps on the bombing range, physically blocking the flights and risking arrest. They took their case to international human rights bodies. But the Canadian government and NATO continued the flights, arguing that the training was essential for military readiness. The economic benefits to the town of Happy Valley Goose Bay, where the airbase was located, were prioritized over the rights and well-being of the Innu. It wasn't until the early 2000s, after years of resistance and international pressure, that the low-level flights were significantly reduced. But by then, the damage to Innu culture and livelihoods was already profound. Number 37. The Duplessis. Orphans were thousands of children in Quebec who were falsely certified as mentally ill in the 1940s and 1950s so that the Catholic Church and the provincial government could receive increased federal subsidies. Under Premier Maurice Duplessis, Quebec's social services were largely run by the Catholic Church. Orphanages received small subsidies from the federal government, but psychiatric hospitals received much larger payments. To increase revenue, the Duplessis government reclassified many orphanages as psychiatric institutions and falsely diagnosed healthy children as mentally defective. Children who had been abandoned, orphaned, or born out of wedlock were now labeled as insane and locked up in asylums where they were subjected to abuse, medical experimentation, and forced labor. Many of these children were used as test subjects for experimental drugs developed by pharmaceutical companies. Others were forced to work in institutional laundries, farms, and workshops, generating revenue for the church. The conditions in these institutions were horrific. Children were beaten, sexually abused, and subjected to electroshock therapy and lobotomies for minor infractions or for no reason at all. They received little to no education and were denied any hope of a normal life. When they reached adulthood, many Duplessis orphans were released from the institutions with nothing but a false psychiatric record that followed them for the rest of their lives, making it nearly impossible to find work or housing. In the 1990s, survivors of the Duplessis orphans began organizing and demanding justice. They wanted their false psychiatric records destroyed. They wanted compensation for the abuse and exploitation they had suffered, and they wanted accountability from the Quebec government and the Catholic Church. In 1999, the Quebec government offered a token compensation of $10,000 per survivor, an insult given the scale and severity of the crimes committed against them. The Catholic Church never apologized and never compensated the victims. To this day, Many Duplessis orphans live in poverty, struggling with the long-term effects of the trauma they endured as children. Number 38. The forced relocation of Inuit families from Inukjuak to Grise, Fjord, and Resolute Bay in the 1950s was sold to the families as an opportunity for better hunting, but it was really about asserting Canadian sovereignty in the high Arctic during the Cold War. The families who volunteered for relocation were promised they could return to Inukjuak after 2 years if the Arctic communities didn't work out. That promise was never honored. When the 2 years were up and families asked to be returned home, the government refused, claiming it would be too expensive. The relocated families endured extreme hardship in the high Arctic. They had been moved from an area where the sun set in winter to the extreme polar environment of the high Arctic, where there were months of total darkness. The psychological impact of the endless night, combined with the isolation and inadequate supplies, was devastating. Children grew up in conditions of severe deprivation. The RCMP officers stationed in the communities to maintain Canadian sovereignty had far better living conditions than the Inuit families who were supposed to be settlers. The Mounties had insulated housing, regular supplies, and communication with the outside world. The Inuit families had tents and temporary shelters and were left to fend for themselves in one of the harshest environments on Earth. This differential treatment made it clear that the Inuit were not valued as citizens, but were being used as tools of geopolitical strategy. It took until 2010 for the Canadian government to apologize for the high Arctic relocations, acknowledging that the hardship and suffering experienced by the Inuit families was both foreseeable and preventable. But the apology came too late for many of the original relocatees, who had already died waiting for recognition of the injustice they had endured. The scars of the relocation remain in the communities of Grise, Fjord, and Resolute Bay, where descendants of the relocated families still live in some of the most isolated and challenging conditions in Canada. Number 39. The Manitoba scrip system was designed to dispossess the Métis of their land through fraud and legal manipulation. Under the Manitoba Act of 1870, the Métis were promised land grants to protect their rights and ensure they would have a place in the new province. But the federal government created a scrip system instead, issuing certificates that entitled Métis families to either land or money. The scrip system was deliberately complicated and bureaucratic, requiring Métis people to navigate a legal process they didn't understand, often in a language they didn't speak. Land speculators and lawyers quickly saw an opportunity for profit. They descended on Métis communities, offering to buy scrip certificates for cash, usually a fraction of their actual value. Métis families who needed money immediately to survive were pressured to sell their scrip, rather than wait years for the government to process their land claims. Once the scrip was sold, the speculators would use it to acquire prime farmland that they would then sell to settlers at a huge profit. The government did nothing to stop this fraud. In fact, government officials were often complicit, providing information to speculators about which Métis families had valuable land scrip and when they would be receiving it. By the time the scrip system ended, the vast majority of Métis people had lost their land. They became a dispossessed people, landless in a province that was supposed to protect their rights. The scrip fraud was not an accident or an unintended consequence. It was a deliberate strategy to transfer Métis land to white settlers while maintaining the appearance of legal fairness. Number 40. The forced sterilization of Indigenous women in Canadian hospitals continued well into the 1970s, long after the official eugenics programs had supposedly ended. Indigenous women who went to hospitals to give birth were sometimes sterilized without their knowledge or consent. Doctors would perform tubal ligations during cesarean sections without informing the patient. Women were told they were signing consent forms for the cesarean, when in fact they were signing consent for sterilization. Documents often presented in English to women who spoke Cree or other indigenous languages. In some cases, women were coerced into agreeing to sterilization by being told that if they didn't consent, their newborn babies would be taken away by child welfare authorities. This threat was not empty. The 60s scoop was in full swing, and Indigenous mothers knew that social workers had the power to apprehend their children at any time. The forced sterilization of Indigenous women was part of a broader genocidal policy aimed at reducing the Indigenous population. The practice was particularly widespread in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. In 2017, the United Nations Committee Against Torture condemned Canada for the continued coerced sterilization of Indigenous women, noting that the practice had persisted well into the 21st century. In 2018, Senator Yvonne Boyer, a Métis lawyer and former nurse, brought forward testimony from Indigenous women who had been forcibly sterilized in the 2000s and 2010s, proving that this crime against humanity had never truly stopped. Some of the women who came forward described being sterilized as recently as 2012 in Saskatchewan hospitals, where doctors told them it was necessary for their health or that they already had enough children. The trauma of forced sterilization affected not just the women themselves, but their families and communities, robbing them of the ability to have children and reinforcing the genocidal message that Indigenous people were not wanted in their own land. Number 41. The 1976 James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement, often celebrated as a landmark treaty that gave Cree and Inuit communities control over their territories, was signed under duress and contained clauses that extinguished Indigenous title to vast areas of land in exchange for financial compensation that was inadequate and quickly eroded by inflation. The agreement was negotiated in the context of Quebec's massive James Bay hydroelectric project, which planned to dam and divert rivers across northern Quebec, flooding thousands of square kilometers of Cree and Inuit hunting and fishing territory. The Quebec government and Hydro-Quebec began construction on the dams, before consulting with Indigenous communities who would be affected. When the Cree and Inuit went to court to stop the project, the judge initially granted an injunction halting construction, recognizing that Indigenous rights had been violated. But the injunction was quickly overturned on appeal, and the Cree and Inuit were told that if they wanted any say in the project, they would have to negotiate an agreement. The negotiations were unequal from the start. The Cree and Inuit were facing the combined power of the Quebec and federal governments, Hydro-Quebec, and the construction companies that had already invested millions in the project. They were told that construction would proceed with or without their agreement, and that if they didn't sign, they would get nothing. The final agreement provided financial compensation and some measures to mitigate environmental damage, but it also required the Cree and Inuit to extinguish their Aboriginal title to a huge area of land, giving up their inherent rights in exchange for rights defined and limited by the agreement. In the decades since, the Cree and Inuit have had to fight repeatedly to enforce the terms of the agreement, to stop further development projects, and to protect what remains of their traditional territories from industrial encroachment. Number 42. The Northwest Passage sovereignty dispute has led Canada to use Inuit communities as human shields to assert territorial claims against other nations, particularly the United States, which considers the Northwest Passage to be international waters. Since the 1950s, the Canadian government has encouraged Inuit settlement in the high Arctic, partly to demonstrate effective occupation and control over the region. When the United States sent the oil tanker Manhattan through the Northwest Passage in 1969 without asking Canada's permission, it was a direct challenge to Canadian sovereignty. Canada responded by asserting its control over the waters, but has never had the military capacity to enforce those claims. Instead, Canada has relied on the presence of Inuit communities as proof of Canadian sovereignty, pointing to Inuit hunters and settlements as evidence that the Arctic is not empty territory, but land that has been inhabited and used by Canadians for thousands of years. This strategy turns Inuit people into geopolitical tools, valued not for their own sake, but for what their presence can prove to other nations. The Canadian government has invested in Inuit communities in the high Arctic only to the extent necessary to maintain a visible Canadian presence, providing minimal infrastructure and services, while expecting Inuit families to continue living in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. Meanwhile, climate change is opening the Northwest Passage to year-round shipping, increasing international pressure on Canada's sovereignty claims. The Inuit, whose traditional knowledge and way of life are being destroyed by climate change and industrial development, are once again being used as pawns in a geopolitical game that prioritizes national interests over Indigenous rights and well-being. Number 43. The contamination of Grassy Narrows First Nation in Ontario. By mercury dumping from a pulp and paper mill has caused ongoing health crises that span 3 generations, and the government has done almost nothing to clean up the pollution or provide adequate health care to the affected community. Between 1962 and 1970, the Dryden Chemical Company dumped over 9,000 kilograms of mercury into the Wabigoon River system upstream from Grassy Narrows. The mercury entered the aquatic food chain and accumulated in the fish that the Grassy Narrows people depended on for food. By the early 1970s, the first cases of Meinamata disease, a severe neurological disorder caused by mercury poisoning, began appearing in the community. People experienced tremors, loss of coordination, numbness in the hands and feet, tunnel vision, and cognitive impairment. The symptoms were devastating and irreversible. Children born to mothers who had been exposed to mercury suffered from developmental delays, learning disabilities, and physical deformities. The Ontario government knew about the mercury contamination as early as 1970, but did nothing to stop the dumping and failed to warn the people of Grassy Narrows that the fish they were eating were poisoned. When the contamination finally became public, commercial fishing licenses in the area were revoked, destroying the local economy and leaving the community dependent on government welfare. But no effort was made to clean up the mercury or to provide proper medical care to those who were already sick. Decades later, mercury levels in the river system remain dangerously high. New generations of children are still being born with mercury-related health problems. The community has one of the highest rates of suicide in Canada, a direct result of the economic devastation, health crisis, and government neglect that followed the mercury poisoning. In 2017, the federal and provincial governments finally promised funding for a treatment center in Grassy Narrows, but as of 2020, the center had not yet been built. The people of Grassy Narrows are still waiting for justice, still suffering the effects of a crime that happened over 50 years ago. Number 44. The Canadian government's response to the AIDS crisis in the 1980s was characterized by deliberate neglect, homophobia, and policies that allowed tainted blood to infect thousands of Canadians with HIV and hepatitis C. In the early 1980s, when AIDS was first identified and linked to blood transfusions, the Canadian Red Cross and government health officials were slow to implement screening measures for donated blood. Even after it became clear that the blood supply was contaminated, the Red Cross continued to use blood from high-risk donors and failed to properly test donations. Between 1980 and 1985, thousands of Canadians who received blood transfusions or blood products were infected with HIV, or hepatitis C. Hemophiliacs, who required regular transfusions of blood clotting factors, were particularly hard hit. An estimated 2,000 Canadians contracted HIV from tainted blood, and as many as 30,000 were infected with hepatitis C. Many of those infected were children. The government knew the blood supply was contaminated, but chose not to act decisively because of the cost of implementing new screening procedures and because of stigma and discrimination against gay men who were seen as the primary victims of AIDS and therefore not worthy of urgent public health intervention. When the tainted blood scandal finally became public in the late 1980s, the government tried to minimize the extent of the problem and avoid responsibility. It took years of advocacy by victims and their families before a public inquiry was established. The Crever Inquiry, completed in 1997, found that the Red Cross and government health officials had been negligent and that thousands of infections could have been prevented. But by then, many of the victims had already died. Survivors and families of those who died received financial compensation, but the amounts were inadequate and came too late for those who had suffered through years of illness, stigma, and premature death. Number 45. The Ipperwash crisis of 1995 involved the fatal shooting of Indigenous protester Dudley George by an Ontario provincial police officer during a land dispute at Ipperwash Provincial Park. The park had been built on land that was a sacred burial ground for the Stony Point First Nation. During World War II, the federal government had expropriated the land from the community, promising it would be returned after the war. That promise was never kept. Instead, the land was turned into a provincial park. In 1995, members of the Stony Point community began a peaceful occupation of the park to reclaim their land and protect the burial grounds. The Ontario government, led by Premier Mike Harris, decided to forcibly remove the protesters. On the night of September 6th, OPP officers launched an assault on the occupation. During the confrontation, Officer Kenneth Dean shot Dudley George in the chest. George, who was unarmed, died in hospital. The government initially claimed that the police had been attacked and had responded in self-defense, but evidence later revealed that the police had been ordered to take aggressive action to remove the protesters quickly and that Dudley George had posed no threat when he was shot. Officer Dean was convicted of criminal negligence causing death, but received only community service as punishment. A public inquiry into the shooting, held years later, found that Premier Harris and other government officials had created a climate that encouraged police to use force against the Indigenous protesters. The inquiry also revealed that Harris had made inflammatory statements about the protesters, calling them criminals and urging police to take action. The Ipperwash crisis became a symbol of how Indigenous land rights are still violently contested in Canada and how police and government officials can act with impunity when confronting Indigenous peoples defending their territories. Number 46, the Africville relocation in Halifax during the 1960s destroyed a thriving black community through a combination of environmental racism, neglect, and forced removal. Africville residents were never provided with basic city services like water, sewage, or garbage collection, even though they paid taxes. Instead, the city of Halifax deliberately placed noxious facilities near Africville, including a slaughterhouse, a prison, an infectious disease hospital, and the city dump. These facilities created health hazards and stigmatized the community as dirty and undesirable, providing the city with a pretext to declare Africville a slum. In the 1960s, the city began expropriating properties in Africville, telling residents they would be relocated to better housing. But the relocation was carried out in a deliberately humiliating manner. Families watched as their homes were demolished and loaded onto garbage trucks. The compensation offered for their properties was far below market value. Many residents ended up in worse conditions in public housing projects far from the community, church, and waterfront that had been the center of their lives. The Africville Church, which had been the heart of the community, was demolished despite promises that it would be preserved. The land where Africville once stood was eventually turned into a park, but by then the community had been erased. Descendants of Africville residents spent decades fighting for recognition of the injustice and for the return of the land. In 2010, the city of Halifax issued an apology and provided some compensation, but it could never undo the cultural and social destruction of a community that had existed for over a century. Number 47. The October crisis of 1970 saw the Canadian government invoke the War Measures Act and suspend civil liberties across the country in response to the kidnapping of a British diplomat and a Quebec cabinet minister by the Front de Libération du Québec. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau declared that the country was in a state of apprehended insurrection and sent the Canadian military into Quebec. Tanks rolled through the streets of Montreal. Soldiers with machine guns guarded government buildings. Under the War Measures Act, police were given sweeping powers to arrest and detain anyone suspected of being connected to the FLQ without charge or trial. Over 450 people were arrested and held for weeks or months without any evidence linking them to terrorist activities. Most of those arrested were intellectuals, artists, union organizers, and political activists who had no connection to the FLQ but were considered sympathetic to Quebec nationalism or left-wing politics. The suspension of civil liberties was widely supported by the Canadian public at the time, fueled by media coverage that portrayed Quebec as on the verge of armed revolution. But the threat was vastly exaggerated. The FLQ was a small, poorly organized group with minimal popular support. The kidnappings were criminal acts, not the beginning of an insurrection. The invocation of the War Measures Act was a massive overreaction that trampled on the rights of innocent people and set a dangerous precedent for the suspension of civil liberties in times of crisis. Number 48. The Canadian government's medical experiments on malnourished Indigenous children in the 1940s and 1950s were conducted without informed consent and deliberately withheld nutritional supplements from children to study the effects of vitamin deficiencies. Researchers working for the federal government saw Indigenous communities where malnutrition was widespread due to poverty and government neglect as perfect laboratories for nutritional studies. In one experiment conducted at 6 residential schools between 1948 and 1952, researchers divided malnourished children into groups. Some were given vitamin supplements, others were not, so that researchers could compare their growth and development. The children and their parents were never told they were part of an experiment. The children who were denied supplements continued to suffer from preventable nutritional deficiencies because scientists wanted to observe the effects. In other experiments, Indigenous children at the Kenora Indian Hospital and Norway House Indian Hospital were fed diets deliberately low in certain vitamins to measure how long it would take for deficiency symptoms to appear. These experiments violated every principle of medical ethics and human rights. They treated Indigenous children as less than human, as research subjects rather than patients deserving of care. The full extent of these medical experiments only came to light in 2013 when historian Ian Mosby published research documenting the government's nutritional studies. There has been no accountability for the researchers who conducted these experiments, and no compensation for the survivors or families of the children who were used as test subjects. Number 49. The 1982 patriation of the Canadian Constitution happened without the consent of Quebec, creating a constitutional crisis that continues to shape Canadian politics today. When Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau moved to patriate the Constitution from Britain and add a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, he faced opposition from several provinces. Quebec, Premier René Lévesque initially joined with other premiers to demand that patriation include recognition of provincial rights and Quebec's distinct status within Canada. But Trudeau negotiated a deal with the other premiers late one night in November 1981, a meeting that became known as the Night of the Long Knives, because Quebec was excluded from the negotiations. The next morning, Lévesque discovered that the other provinces had agreed to Trudeau's terms, leaving Quebec isolated. The Constitution was patriated in 1982 without Quebec's signature. To this day, Quebec has never formally agreed to the Constitution Act of 1982, creating a legal and political situation where Quebec exists within a constitutional framework it never consented to. Subsequent attempts to bring Quebec into the constitutional fold, including the Meech Lake Accord and the Charlottetown Accord, both failed. The constitutional exclusion of Quebec fed into the growth of the sovereignty movement and led to the 1995 Quebec referendum on independence, which came within 1 percentage point of succeeding. The constitutional crisis created by the patriation remains unresolved, a fundamental flaw in Canada's legal and political structure. Number 50. The treatment of Chinese railroad workers who built the Canadian Pacific Railway in the 1880s was nothing short of slavery in all but name. Chinese laborers were paid half the wages of white workers for doing the most dangerous work. They were given the job of blasting tunnels through the Rocky Mountains using dynamite. The work was incredibly hazardous. Thousands of Chinese workers died in avalanches, explosions, and accidents. Their bodies were buried along the railway line in unmarked graves. No records were kept of their names or how many died. Estimates range from 600 to over 4,000 deaths, but the true number will never be known. Chinese workers lived in tent camps along the construction route, enduring harsh winters with inadequate food and shelter. They had no legal rights and no recourse when they were cheated of wages or injured on the job. When the railway was completed in 1885, the Chinese workers who had sacrificed so much to build it were suddenly unwanted. The federal government imposed the head tax to prevent more Chinese immigration and to punish those who had already come. The contribution of Chinese workers to building Canada's national railway was erased from history for over a century. It wasn't until 2006 that the Canadian government formally apologized for the head tax and the exclusion of Chinese immigrants, but there was no compensation for the descendants of the workers who died building the railway or for the families who were separated by racist immigration policies. Number 51. The forced relocation of Japanese Canadians during World War II extended beyond the initial internment to a policy of dispersal that deliberately broke up families and communities. After the war ended in 1945, Japanese Canadians were told they had two choices: move east of the Rocky Mountains or be deported to Japan, a country many of them had never seen. Those who chose to stay in Canada were prohibited from returning to the West Coast. Families who had lived in British Columbia for generations were forced to start over. In provinces where they had no connections, no community, and no support. The dispersal policy was designed to prevent Japanese Canadians from ever re-establishing themselves as a cohesive community on the West Coast. The government believed that scattering them across the country would force assimilation and eliminate any future threat they might pose. This policy of dispersal continued until 1949, 4 years after the war ended, and the ban on returning to the West Coast wasn't lifted until 1949. By that time, most Japanese Canadians had already rebuilt their lives elsewhere. Their businesses, homes, and fishing boats had been sold off. Their communities had been destroyed. Even when they were finally allowed to return, there was nothing left to return to. Number 52. The Caledonia land dispute in Ontario, which began in 2006 and continues intermittently to this day, has exposed how Canadian authorities treat Indigenous land defenders versus non-Indigenous protesters. The dispute centers on a housing development being built on land that is part of the Haldimand Tract, territory promised to the Six Nations of the Grand River in 1784. In February 2006, Six Nations community members set up a blockade on the construction site, halting development. The Ontario Provincial Police initially attempted to remove the protesters, but backed off after the situation escalated. For months, the occupation continued while the provincial and federal governments negotiated with Six Nations representatives. During this time, local non-Indigenous residents organized counter-protests, demanding that police forcibly remove the Six Nations protesters. Some of these counter-protesters engaged in violence and intimidation, but police did not arrest them or use force against them the way they had attempted to do against Indigenous land defenders. The double standard was stark. Indigenous people peacefully defending their treaty rights were met with police raids and arrests, while non-Indigenous people engaging in violent counter-protests were largely left alone. The land dispute has never been fully resolved. Negotiations have stalled repeatedly. The underlying issue of the Haldimand Tract and the extent of Six Nations territory remains unresolved more than 2 centuries after the original land grant. Number 53. The forced attendance policies at residential schools were enforced through the use of truant officers and police who would physically remove children from their homes if parents refused to send them to the schools. Under amendments to the Indian Act, it became illegal for Indigenous parents to keep their children home from residential school. Parents who resisted faced fines and imprisonment. Indian agents had the authority to remove children by force, and they used it regularly. There are documented cases of RCMP officers riding onto reserves, taking children from their mothers' arms, and loading them onto trucks or trains bound for residential schools hundreds of miles away. Parents who tried to visit their children at the schools were often turned away. Children who tried to run away were hunted down, returned to the schools, and punished severely. Some children died trying to escape, freezing to death in the winter cold as they tried to walk home across miles of wilderness. The forced attendance policy meant that Indigenous parents were criminalized for trying to protect their children, and that Indigenous children grew up believing their parents had abandoned them, not knowing that their parents had fought desperately to keep them home and had been punished for trying. Number 54. The displacement of Mi'kmaq communities in Nova Scotia to make way for military bases, national parks, and white settlement destroyed Indigenous economies and forced assimilation. In the early 20th century, Mi'kmaq families were evicted from their traditional territories to create Kejimkujik National Park. They were told the land needed to be preserved in its natural state, yet they had lived on and cared for that land for thousands of years. The creation of the park criminalized their traditional hunting, fishing, and gathering practices, turning them into poachers on their own land. Similarly, during World War II, Mi'kmaq communities near Halifax were displaced to make room for military installations. Families were given little notice and inadequate compensation. They were forced to move to reserves with poor soil, limited resources, and no economic opportunities. The systematic displacement of Mi'kmaq people from their lands was part of a broader strategy to confine Indigenous peoples to small reserves and force them to give up their traditional ways of life in favor of farming or wage labor, both of which were difficult or impossible on the marginal lands they were left with. Number 55. the criminalization of Indigenous spiritual practices through the Indian Act banned ceremonies like the sun dance, the thirst dance, and the potlatch for over 60 years. Between 1885 and 1951, it was illegal for Indigenous peoples to practice their religions. Those caught holding ceremonies could be imprisoned. Sacred objects were confiscated and sold to museums. Spiritual leaders were arrested. The ban on ceremonies was part of the government's assimilation policy, an attempt to destroy Indigenous cultures by criminalizing the very practices that held communities together and transmitted knowledge from generation to generation. When the bans were finally lifted in 1951, much damage had already been done. A generation of young people had grown up without access to their ceremonies. Sacred knowledge had been lost or had to be practiced in secret. The trauma of having one's religion criminalized, of being told that your most sacred practices were illegal and immoral, had profound psychological and cultural effects that are still felt today. Number 56. The forced relocation of Innu families from Labrador to the settlement of Davis Inlet and later to Natuashish created a humanitarian crisis marked by substance abuse, suicide, and the loss of traditional culture. The Innu of Labrador were a nomadic people who lived on the land, following caribou herds and maintaining a close connection to their territory. In 1967, the federal and provincial governments forced the Innu to settle in Davis Inlet, a remote island community with no economic opportunities and inadequate housing. The settlement was built on a barren rock with no source of fresh water and no connection to the traditional hunting grounds. Cut off from their land-based way of life, the community descended into crisis. By the 1990s, Davis Inlet had become infamous for gas, sniffing among children, alarming suicide rates, and overcrowded, dilapidated housing. In 1993, a video of Innu children high on gasoline, saying they wanted to die, shocked the nation and forced the government to take action. The government's solution was to relocate the community again, this time to a new settlement called Natuashish on the mainland. The relocation cost over $150 million, making it one of the most expensive relocations in Canadian history. But moving the community to a new location did not address the underlying problems of trauma, poverty, and disconnection from the land. Substance abuse, suicide, and social problems continued in Natuashish, proving that the crisis was not about the physical location, but about the forced sedentarization and cultural destruction that had been imposed on the Innu. Number 57. The Indian residential school system used children as forced labor to keep the schools running. Children as young as 6 were assigned daily work duties that took up half their school day. Boys worked in fields, barns, and workshops. Girls worked in kitchens, sewing rooms, and laundries. The schools were deliberately understaffed to save money, and child labor was essential to maintaining the institutions. Many students left residential schools without basic literacy or math skills. The forced labor was dangerous. Children operated heavy machinery without training. Farm accidents were common. Some children died from injuries sustained while working. The schools profited from the children's labor, selling crops and goods produced by student workers while providing inadequate food and medical care. Number 58. The prohibition on Indigenous peoples. Hiring lawyers to pursue land claims, in effect from 1927 to 1951, was accompanied by a ban on political organizing that made it illegal for more than 3 Indigenous people to gather for political purposes without government permission. Leaders who tried to organize meetings could be arrested. The Indian Act gave Indian agents total power over reserved communities. Indigenous people who spoke out could be denied treaty payments, have their children taken away, or be evicted from their reserve. The political suppression lasted for decades. Number 59. The Kenora paper mill strike of 1974 exposed systemic racism when Indigenous workers, who made up a significant portion of the workforce, were relegated to the lowest paid and most dangerous jobs. When Indigenous workers tried to form their own union local to address discrimination, they faced opposition from both the company and the white-dominated union. Indigenous workers were paid less for the same work, passed over for promotions, and subjected to racial harassment. When they organized to fight back, they were portrayed as troublemakers. Number 60. The criminalization of Indigenous languages in residential schools was enforced through brutal punishments, including beatings, having mouths washed out with soap, being locked in closets, and public humiliation. Children caught speaking. Their languages had needles stuck through their tongues in some schools. They were made to stand in front of the class while other students mocked them. The psychological impact of being punished for speaking one's mother tongue was devastating. Children learned to associate their languages with shame and pain. Many stopped speaking their languages entirely. This linguistic genocide has resulted in the near extinction of many Indigenous languages in Canada. Of the over 70 Indigenous languages spoken before contact, many now have fewer than 1,000 fluent speakers, and some have fewer than 10. Number 61. The construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway in the 1950s flooded Mohawk communities along the St. Lawrence River, destroying homes, farms, and sacred sites without adequate consultation or compensation. The Mohawk community of Kanawake lost significant portions of their territory. Families were forced to relocate as water levels rose. Cemeteries were flooded and graves were not properly relocated before the flooding began. The economic benefits of the Seaway went entirely to non-Indigenous interests, while Indigenous communities bore the costs of displacement and environmental destruction. Number 62. The Indian Act's prohibition on Indigenous peoples owning land off reserve, in effect until 1960 in some provinces, meant that Indigenous people could not purchase property or businesses outside of reserve lands. Even Indigenous veterans who had served in World War I and World War II were denied the land grants and business loans offered to white veterans. This discriminatory policy ensured that Indigenous people remained economically marginalized and dependent on government support. Number 63. The forced enfranchisement provisions of the Indian Act meant that any Indigenous person who wanted to vote, attend university, become a professional, or in some cases simply live off reserve, had to give up their Indian status and sever all legal ties to their community. Enfranchisement meant you were no longer legally Indigenous. You lost your right to live on reserve, lost access to treaty benefits, and your children would not be registered as status Indians. This created an impossible choice: pursue education and opportunity, or maintain your legal identity and connection to your community. The policy deliberately targeted Indigenous people who showed signs of success, removing them from their communities and preventing the development of Indigenous leadership on reserves. Number 64. The Indian Act's provisions regarding Indigenous women who married non-Indigenous men stripped these women and their children of their Indian status. Under Section 12, 1B of the Act, an Indigenous woman who married a non-Indigenous man automatically lost her status, was forced to leave the reserve, and lost all treaty rights. Her children were also denied status. But an Indigenous man who married a non-Indigenous woman not only kept his status, his wife and children gained status. This blatantly sexist policy destroyed families and communities. Women who married non-Indigenous men were exiled from their homes, cut off from their families, and denied any legal recognition of their Indigenous identity. The policy wasn't repealed until 1985, after decades of advocacy by Indigenous women's groups. Number 65. The Burgay Inquiry into the proposed Mackenzie Valley pipeline in the 1970s, revealed how resource development projects were planned and approved without meaningful consultation with Indigenous communities whose lands would be affected. Justice Thomas Berger traveled to communities across the Northwest Territories and Yukon to hear from Indigenous peoples. He found that the federal government and energy companies had already decided to build the pipeline and were simply going through the motions of consultation. Indigenous communities testified about protecting caribou, migration routes, rivers, and traditional hunting grounds. They spoke about social impacts of rapid development, including substance abuse and loss of culture. Berger's final report recommended a 10-year moratorium. The pipeline was ultimately not built, but the pattern of approving projects, despite Indigenous opposition, has continued. Number 66. The poisoning of Indigenous communities by industrial pollution extends beyond grassy narrows to the contamination of the Athabasca River by tar sands development in Alberta, where downstream First Nations communities have experienced elevated cancer rates and fish deformities. The Mikisew Cree, First Nation, and Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation have documented cases of rare cancers, autoimmune diseases, and mysterious illnesses that emerged in the decades since tar sands development began upstream. Traditional foods like fish and game have become unsafe to eat. Water quality has deteriorated. The companies and government regulators have consistently downplayed health impacts and refused to acknowledge the connection between industrial pollution and the health crisis. Number 67. The White Paper of 1969, proposed by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and Indian Affairs Minister Jean Chrétien, would have abolished the Indian Act, eliminated Indian status, dissolved reserves, and transferred responsibility for Indigenous peoples to the provinces. The policy was presented as progressive, a way to give Indigenous peoples equality by treating them the same as all other Canadians. But Indigenous leaders immediately recognized it as termination policy, an attempt to eliminate Indigenous peoples as distinct political and legal entities and assimilate them completely into Canadian society. The White Paper would have extinguished treaty rights, ended federal responsibility, and made it impossible to pursue land claims. Indigenous leaders organized a national campaign against it. The National Indian Brotherhood issued the Red Paper, which rejected assimilation and demanded recognition of Indigenous rights, treaty implementation, and Indigenous control over Indigenous affairs. The opposition was so strong that the government was forced to withdraw the White Paper in 1970. But the assimilationist thinking has never fully disappeared from Canadian policy. Number 68. The 1885 pass system that restricted Indigenous peoples' movement off reserves was never actually law, yet it was enforced for over 50 years with the full knowledge of the federal government. There was no legislation authorizing the pass system, no regulation making it legal. It was simply policy, implemented by Indian agents and enforced by police, based on the assumption that Indigenous peoples had no rights. The pass system turned reserves into open-air prisons where people could not leave without written permission from an Indian agent. The fact that this system operated for decades without legal authority shows how completely Indigenous peoples were excluded from the protection of Canadian law. Number 69. The expansion of national parks across Canada frequently involved the forced removal of Indigenous peoples from their traditional territories and the criminalization of their hunting, fishing, and gathering practices. Banff National Park, established in 1885, led to the eviction of the Stoney Nakoda people from the Bow Valley. Jasper National Park displaced the Simpcw and other First Nations. Pacific Rim National Park Reserve resulted in the removal of Nucha Nulth families from their villages. In each case, the creation of the park was justified by the myth of wilderness, the idea that these were pristine, uninhabited landscapes. But these landscapes had been inhabited and actively managed by Indigenous peoples for thousands of years. The parks erased Indigenous presence and then prohibited Indigenous peoples from accessing the lands for traditional purposes. Number 70. The criminalization of Indigenous cultural practices extended to the banning of Indigenous dancing, singing, and festivals. The Indian Act amendments that banned the potlatch and other ceremonies also prohibited any gathering where dancing or traditional performances took place. Indigenous peoples who wanted to perform traditional dances at fairs or exhibitions had to get written permission from Indian agents. Indigenous culture was allowed to exist only when it could be commodified and controlled for the entertainment of white audiences. Number 71. The lack of clean drinking water on reserves is the result of decades of deliberate underfunding of infrastructure on reserve lands. As of 2021, there were still dozens of long-term drinking water advisories in First Nations communities across Canada, some lasting over 20 years. People in these communities cannot drink the water from their taps. They have to boil water or rely on bottled water. The water infrastructure in many communities is so inadequate that sewage backs up into homes. The federal government has known about these problems for decades, but has consistently failed to invest the money needed to build proper water treatment facilities. Meanwhile, non-Indigenous communities just kilometers away have clean, safe drinking water. The water crisis on reserves is a direct result of systemic discrimination. Number 72. The Chani-Wenjack case exposed the deadly consequences of the residential school system. In 1966, 12-year-old Chani-Wenjack ran away from Cecilia Jeffrey Indian Residential School in Kenora, Ontario, trying to walk home to his family on the Martin Falls First Nation Reserve, over 600 kilometers away. He was found dead beside the railway track 7 days later, having died of exposure and starvation. He was wearing only a light jacket in late October weather. Cheney's death led to a brief inquest, but the systemic problems that caused his death were ignored. The schools continued to operate. Children continued to run away. Many others died trying to get home. Number 73. The testing of Agent Orange and other chemical weapons by the Canadian military at CFB Gagetown in New Brunswick. From the 1950s to the 1980s, contaminated land and water used by Indigenous communities and exposed military personnel and civilians to toxic chemicals that caused cancer and other serious health problems. Thousands of people, including members of nearby First Nations communities, were exposed without their knowledge or consent. The military knew the chemicals were dangerous but conducted the tests anyway. It wasn't until the early 2000s that the extent of the contamination became public, and even then the government was slow to acknowledge responsibility or provide compensation. Number 74. The Indian Act's ban on Indigenous peoples entering pool halls, billiard rooms, or other places of amusement without permission from an Indian agent, which remained in effect until 1951, was part of a broader system of social control that regulated every aspect of Indigenous peoples' lives. Indigenous people needed permission to leave the reserve, to sell produce from their farms, to hire a lawyer, to organize politically, even to gather for social purposes. The level of control was totalitarian, treating Indigenous peoples as perpetual children who needed constant supervision and discipline. Number 75. The residential school nutrition experiments weren't limited to denying children vitamins. In some schools, children were deliberately given diets known to cause malnutrition, so researchers could study the long-term effects. At the Alberni Indian Residential School, children were divided into groups and fed different diets to compare outcomes. Some children were given milk, others were denied it. Some received dental care, Others did not, so researchers could study the relationship between nutrition and tooth decay. These experiments violated every principle of medical ethics, treating indigenous children as laboratory animals rather than human beings deserving of care and dignity. Number 76. The provincial residential school system in British Columbia operated alongside the federal system and was in some ways even worse. Provincial schools received less funding than federal schools and had even higher death rates. Children in provincial schools were used as laborers in local industries, hired out to farms and canneries for wages that the schools kept. The provincial government was supposed to provide education to Indigenous children who weren't covered by federal responsibility, but instead used them as a source of cheap labor while providing minimal schooling. Number 77. The 1990 standoff at Kansatake, known as the Oka Crisis, wasn't just about a golf course expansion. It was about 270 years of ignored land claims. The Mohawk people of Kansatake had been trying to get recognition of their land rights since the 1700s, when land that had been set aside for their use was sold to private interest by Catholic priests who held the title. The Mohawks had pursued their claim through every available legal avenue for centuries and had been ignored or rejected at every turn. The golf course expansion was simply the final insult that made it clear the Canadian legal system would never voluntarily recognize Mohawk land rights. Number 78. The Indian hospital system, which operated separately from the regular healthcare system until the 1980s, provided substandard care to Indigenous patients while using them as research subjects. Indigenous tuberculosis patients were kept in isolation for years, separated from their families and communities. They received experimental treatments that had serious side effects. Many died far from home and were buried in unmarked graves without their families being notified. The segregated hospital system reinforced the message that Indigenous peoples were inferior and did not deserve the same quality of care as other Canadians. Number 79. The missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis, documented by the National Inquiry, which reported in 2019, found evidence of genocide. Over 4,000 Indigenous women and girls have gone missing or been murdered in Canada since the 1980s, a rate of violence far higher than that experienced by non-Indigenous women. The inquiry found that this violence was the result of systemic racism, sexism, and colonialism, and that Canadian institutions, including police, child welfare, and the justice system, had failed to protect Indigenous women and girls. In many cases, police didn't investigate disappearances seriously, dismissing missing Indigenous women as runaways or sex workers whose lives didn't matter. Number 80. The forced adoption of Indigenous children into non-Indigenous families during the 60s. Scoop often involved adoption agencies lying to birth mothers, telling them their babies had died when in fact the children had been adopted out to families in Canada, the United States, or Europe. Mothers grieved children who were still alive. Children grew up believing they had been abandoned when their mothers had been told they were dead. When some of these adoptees later tried to find their birth families, they discovered that their entire lives had been based on a lie. Number 81. The destruction of the Ktunaxa Nation's sacred Katmuk site in southeastern British Columbia by a ski resort development approved by the federal and provincial governments, despite Ktunaxa opposition, showed that Indigenous spiritual sites have no protection under Canadian law. The Ktunaxa people had fought the development for over 20 years, arguing that the area was a sacred site where the grizzly bear spirit was born. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, which ruled in 2017 that while the Ktunaxa had a right to practice their religion, that right did not extend to protecting sacred sites from development. The ruling meant that Indigenous sacred places can be destroyed if economic interests are deemed more important. Number 82. The use of electric shocks as punishment in residential schools was documented at multiple institutions. Children who wet their beds were given electric shocks. Children who tried to run away were shocked. The shocks were administered as a form of torture disguised as discipline, justified by the belief that Indigenous children needed to have the Indian beaten out of them. This abuse was known to school administrators, government inspectors, and church officials, yet it continued for decades. Number 83. The 1939 Supreme Court of Canada decision in the reference Ari Eskimos case determined that Inuit peoples were Indians for the purposes of federal jurisdiction. This decision was made without consulting Inuit communities and was based on a legal technicality rather than any recognition of Inuit rights or identity. The case reflected the colonial mindset that Indigenous peoples were legal problems to be sorted out. Number 84. The systemic sexual abuse of Indigenous children in residential schools was so widespread that it can only be described as institutionalized rape. Priests, nuns, teachers, staff, and older students abused younger children. When children reported the abuse, they were punished for lying or told to keep quiet. Abusers were rarely held accountable. Instead, they were often transferred to other schools where they continued to abuse more children. The churches that ran the schools knew about the abuse, but prioritized protecting the institution's reputation over protecting children. The intergenerational trauma of this abuse continues to affect Indigenous communities today. Number 85. The Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, reached in 2006, provided compensation to survivors, but the amounts were based on a formula that many survivors felt was inadequate. Survivors received a common experience payment of $10,000 for the first year of attendance and $3,000 for each additional year. Additional compensation was available for those who could prove specific abuses, but the process required survivors to relive their trauma in hearings that were often re-traumatizing. Many survivors felt the settlement was more about limiting liability than delivering justice. Number 86. The pass system and other movement restrictions meant that Indigenous peoples during World War I and World War II often needed special permission to enlist in the military. Those who did serve fought for a country that denied them basic rights. Indigenous veterans were not eligible for the same benefits as non-Indigenous veterans when they returned home. They could not get veterans' land grants to purchase farms because they were not allowed to own property off reserve. They could not get business loans to start enterprises. Despite having served their country with distinction, they returned to reserves where they were still subject to the Indian Act's discriminatory provisions. Number 87. The government's response to the 1990 Oka crisis included sending in the Canadian Army with tanks and helicopters against Mohawk protesters who were protecting a sacred grove and burial ground. The show of overwhelming military force against people defending sacred land sent a clear message about how the Canadian state would respond to Indigenous resistance. The images of soldiers in full combat gear facing off against Mohawk people defending their land shocked many Canadians and brought international attention to the ongoing injustices faced by Indigenous peoples. Number 88. The forced relocation of Dean communities in the Northwest Territories to create the town of Yellowknife and to facilitate mining development disrupted traditional economies and created dependence on wage, labor, and government assistance. Dean families, who had lived mobile lifestyles following caribou and fish, were forced to settle in permanent communities where there were no jobs and no means to continue traditional practices. The relocations benefited mining companies and the territorial government, but devastated Dean communities. Number 89. The residential school system didn't just physically and sexually abuse children, it also engaged in psychological torture, including deliberate humiliation, isolation, and the destruction of personal items from home. Children who brought traditional clothing or objects from their families had them burned in front of them. Family photos were destroyed. Letters from home were withheld or confiscated. The systematic effort to sever children from their families and cultures was a form of psychological warfare designed to break their spirits and their sense of identity. Number 90. The establishment of the Northwest Mounted Police in 1873, the precursor to the RCMP, was explicitly to control indigenous peoples and enforce government policies on the prairies. The Mounties' role wasn't primarily law enforcement in the conventional sense. It was to assert Canadian sovereignty over Indigenous lands, to enforce the reserve system, to suppress Indigenous resistance, and to protect white settlers from Indigenous peoples rather than to protect Indigenous peoples from settlers. The mythology of the friendly Mountie in the red serge coat obscures the force's role as an instrument of colonial control. Number 91. The forced relocation of the Saisi Dean to Churchill in the 1950s was done without any consultation with the community and without any preparation at the relocation site. Families arrived in Churchill to find there was no housing, no infrastructure, nothing. They were dumped at the edge of the town garbage dump and left to survive as best they could. When people complained, government officials blamed the dean for their own suffering, ignoring the fact that the government had destroyed their ability to live on the land. Number 92. The amendment to the Indian Act in 1920 that made attendance at residential school compulsory was championed by Duncan Campbell Scott, the Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs, who stated that Canada's goal was to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic. This was an explicit statement of genocidal intent, a government official openly declaring that the goal was the elimination of Indigenous peoples as distinct peoples. Yet Scott is still honored with monuments, and his poetry is still taught in Canadian schools, with his role in cultural genocide rarely mentioned. Number 93. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which operated from 2008 to 2015, documented over 7,000 deaths at residential schools, but acknowledged that the true number is likely much higher because many deaths were never recorded. Children who died at the schools were often buried in unmarked graves on school grounds. Records were incomplete or destroyed. Parents were not always notified when their children died. The commission called for a comprehensive effort to locate and identify all burial sites, but as of 2021, that work had barely begun. The discovery of unmarked graves at former residential school sites in 2021 shocked Canadians, but survivors had been saying for decades that children had died and been buried at the schools. Number 94. The cultural genocide finding of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was based on the UN definition of genocide, which includes acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. The residential school system, the 60s scoop, forced sterilization, the banning of cultural and spiritual practices, and the prohibition on speaking Indigenous languages all fit this definition. The Commission found that Canada had engaged in cultural genocide, a deliberate policy to destroy Indigenous peoples as distinct peoples and assimilate them into the Canadian mainstream. Number 95. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls heard testimony from over 2,000 people, including survivors of violence, families of missing and murdered women and girls, and experts in various fields. The testimony documented horrific patterns of violence, abuse, and institutional failure. Women and girls testified about being targeted by predators because they were Indigenous, They described how police dismissed their reports or blamed them for the violence they experienced. Families described being told by police that their missing daughters were probably just runaways who would come home eventually, while police made little effort to investigate. Number 96. The child welfare system in Canada continues to apprehend Indigenous children at rates higher than at the peak of the 60s scoop. In some provinces, Indigenous children make up over 90% of children in foster care, despite Indigenous peoples being a small minority of the population. The reasons for apprehension are often poverty-related: inadequate housing, lack of food security, inability to afford childcare. But instead of addressing the poverty that is a direct result of colonial policies, the child welfare system removes children from their families, perpetuating the cycle of trauma and family separation. Number 97. The chronic underfunding of education on reserves means that First Nations students receive thousands of dollars less per student than students in provincial schools. Schools on reserves often lack libraries, science labs, computers, and other resources that are standard in provincial schools. Teachers are often inexperienced or unqualified. The funding gap ensures that Indigenous students are disadvantaged from the start, making it harder for them to succeed academically and perpetuating cycles of poverty and limited opportunity. Number 98. The mercury contamination at Grassy Narrows was compounded by the fact that even after the dumping stopped in 1970, the Ontario government allowed the company responsible to continue operating and expanding its operations. There were no criminal charges. No one went to jail. The company paid a small fine and continued business as usual. This sent a message to other industries that polluting Indigenous lands carried no serious consequences. Number 99. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued 94 calls to action, recommendations for how Canada could begin to address the legacy of residential schools and move toward reconciliation. These calls included implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, providing adequate funding for Indigenous education and child welfare, addressing the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis, and supporting Indigenous language revitalization. As of 2021, fewer than a quarter of the calls to action had been fully implemented. Progress has been slow, and in some areas there has been regression rather than advancement. Number 100. The ongoing crisis of Indigenous youth suicide, with rates in some communities 10 to 20 times the national average, is a direct result of the collective trauma caused by residential schools, the 60s scoop, forced relocations, and ongoing systemic discrimination. Young people growing up in communities devastated by poverty, substance abuse, and loss of culture face overwhelming challenges. Many see no future for themselves. The intergenerational trauma of colonialism has created a mental health crisis that requires resources, support, and a fundamental transformation of the relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples. Number 101. Despite all of this history, despite the documented genocide, the abuse, the theft of land and children and language and culture, there has never been a comprehensive reckoning with Canada's treatment of Indigenous peoples. Apologies have been issued for specific policies and programs, but there has been no fundamental restructuring of the relationship. The Indian Act, though amended many times, still exists and still governs the lives of First Nations peoples. Land claims remain unsettled. Treaties are still being violated. Indigenous communities still lack clean drinking water, adequate housing, and properly funded education and health care. The dark history of Canada is not just history. It continues to shape the present, and until there is real justice, real reconciliation, and real change, it will continue to shape the future. These are the 101 facts about Canadian history they never taught you in school.